The morning they left me at the airport, I wasn't even angry, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after 40 years of paying mortgages, college tuitions, and wedding bills for people who once said, "We'll always take care of you, Dad." I stood there with my small black suitcase half empty, because most of what I owned was now theirs. Or at least that's what they thought. My daughter's husband had that slick smile, the kind that hides behind polite words and contracts written by his own lawyer. "You won't have to worry about anything, sir," he'd said when he handed me the final documents. I remember his pen tapping twice before I signed. It was April 14th, 9:37 a.m., when I wrote my name at the bottom. They took the folder, hugged me, and said they'd drive me to the airport for my retirement trip. By the time my plane ticket was scanned, they were already gone. The car, my home, my accounts, everything had been transferred, except for one document they didn't know existed. One clause I'd added quietly, weeks before, when something in my gut told me to get a second opinion. And that small precaution would turn their victory into a disaster. I sat in that plastic airport chair for nearly an hour, watching flights roll in and out on the departure screen. Paris, Boston, Denver. My ticket said Orlando, but I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't even planning to board. That trip was their idea, a retirement vacation after selling my last commercial property. But I'd never asked for a vacation. I wanted to see my land, my business, my peace of mind stay within family, hands not handed off to a man who had been in our lives for less than 5 years. When I called my daughter to ask where they'd gone, her phone went straight to voicemail. That was when I knew everything I had feared was true. The trust documents, the quitclaim deed, the temporary transfer of property. All of it had been set up not for me, but for them. The lawyer they used wasn't mine. He worked for my son-in-law's development firm. The whole deal was a setup wrapped in smiles. They hadn't driven home. They'd gone straight to my accountant's office. But they didn't know one simple thing. An extra signature line at the bottom of page 11, inserted quietly by the notary I'd used for 30 years, legally reversed the deed within 30 days if payment or relocation confirmation wasn't completed. That clause had cost me a single phone call and $50. They thought they got my property. They didn't know I still owned the leverage. When I returned home that evening, the gate code was changed. My daughter had texted, "Dad, we'll talk in a few weeks. We're finalizing everything." Finalizing what? My name had been on that house since 1994. I built it myself, one paycheck at a time after my wife died. I walked around the perimeter fence, entered through the side shed, still using the old key, and saw boxes stacked everywhere. They'd moved my things to the garage. My grandson's toys were where my office had been. My late wife's piano was covered in a tarp. They'd even removed my name from the mailbox. I didn't say a word. I drove back to my motel downtown and opened a manila envelope I'd kept in a safety deposit box at the credit union. Inside were certified copies of every document I'd ever signed: deeds, insurance transfers, trust amendments, plus one notarized letter dated March 5th, confirming that all property was held under conditional life interest. Meaning, if I was alive, it was mine. Period. That single sentence would destroy everything they'd tried to take. I spent the next 2 days quietly preparing. I contacted my friend Martin, an attorney specializing in real estate reversions. He'd handled veterans' estates for decades. I sent him scanned copies of every page. By Friday morning, he called back. "They tried to record the transfer early," he said, "but the county clerk rejected it. The clause bounced it back automatically. You're still the legal owner." I didn't even smile. I just asked, "So what happens next?" He replied, "If they try to sell or lease anything, it's fraud." That weekend, they held an open house. Yes, my daughter and her husband invited realtors into my home, offering tours, champagne, and a slideshow of available investment properties. I watched it live from the sidewalk, pretending to be a curious neighbor. Their realtor bragged about the location and clear ownership transfer. I took pictures of everything: the sign-in sheet, the posted price, $1.6 million, and even a flyer listing the address as part of their new portfolio. They had no idea the real owner was standing 20 feet away, collecting evidence. Monday morning, 8:42 a.m., I sent everything to Martin. By 10 a.m., a cease and desist letter had been delivered to the realtor, the title company, and the buyers who had placed bids. By noon, the county property database flagged the parcel as under dispute. My son-in-law's company couldn't touch it. The next day, I visited the bank in person. The manager, an old friend, confirmed my trust account hadn't been closed properly. The funds they thought were released were still pending approval from me. I canceled every outgoing transfer and froze the account. $312,000, locked under my control. That afternoon, my daughter called. Her voice was shaking. "Dad, what did you do? The sale's been blocked. The realtor says there's some legal freeze." I said nothing for a few seconds, then replied, "You should ask your husband's lawyer about page 11. Silence. She didn't even breathe. Then quietly she said, "You added something." I answered, "I always read what I signed, do you?" The next day they showed up at my motel. He tried to act calm, wearing his tailored suit, pretending to negotiate. "It's just a misunderstanding, sir." "We'll fix this," he said. I slid a printed statement across the table, a full breakdown of every unauthorized attempt to sell, rent, and withdraw. Each line was time-stamped, recorded, and sent to my attorney. "You tried to liquidate my property," I said. "That's attempted fraud. And since my trust covers all assets, including vehicles and residual shares, you've both violated the agreement." My daughter's eyes filled with tears. He clenched his jaw, staring at the table. "You can't do this," he muttered. I answered simply, "I already did." 2 weeks later, I received a notice from the county recorder confirming full reinstatement of title under my name. Their names were erased from every document. The realtor withdrew. The buyers backed out. My son-in-law's firm lost 2 clients after word spread that he'd been under investigation for property manipulation. He left town quietly. My daughter moved in with her mother-in-law for a while. We haven't spoken since. A month later, I listed the property myself, legally, cleanly, and sold it for $1. $8 million. I donated half to a veterans housing project and bought a small house by the lake with the rest. It's quiet there. Peaceful. Some nights I sit on the porch, listening to the wind across the water, thinking about how easy it is to lose everything when you trust the wrong people. And how powerful it feels when you learn to trust yourself again. They thought they got my property, but what they really lost was their integrity, their future, and the one man who would have helped them without asking anything back. I didn't seek revenge. I just let the papers speak. Weeks passed, and life in that small lakeside town settled into a rhythm that felt almost alien at first. Quiet mornings, the sound of loons instead of traffic, coffee that actually tasted like something. I'd bought the house under a new LLC I registered in my own name, not the family trust. No one could touch it, not even through backdoor claims. But peace never lasts when unfinished business lingers, because silence, I learned, makes guilty people nervous. And by the 3rd week of June, the silence broke. I came home one afternoon and found a white envelope taped to my mailbox. No stamp, no address. Inside was a handwritten note from my daughter. "Dad, please talk to me. It wasn't supposed to happen this way." No apology, no mention of the documents or the open house or the forged signatures. Just a single line at the bottom. "He's in trouble. We both are." I didn't reply right away. Instead, I called Martin again. "She reached out," I said. "What should I do?" He paused, then asked, "Do you still want justice or closure?" I thought about it for a long time. Justice was already done. The property was mine, the accounts were safe, and their names were flagged on county records for attempted fraudulent conveyance. But closure? That was different. So I agreed to meet her. We arranged to meet at a diner halfway between our towns, neutral ground, where nothing carried our family name. When she walked in, she looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but emotionally, like someone who'd been holding a burden too heavy for too long. She didn't even order food, just coffee. "He's being investigated," she said quietly, glancing around. "About your property and other deals." I didn't know how deep it went. I kept my eyes on the table, not her. "You knew enough," I said. She shook her head. "He told me it was all legal. He said you were retiring, that everything was in order. I trusted him." I leaned back. So did I. That was the truth. Then she told me the part that changed everything. My son-in-law hadn't just tried to sell my property. He'd used it as collateral in a private investment deal with his partners, pledging ownership he didn't have. When the sale collapsed, the investors came after him and her. Their accounts were frozen. Their cars repossessed. They'd burned through their savings paying legal fees. "He says you ruined us," she whispered. "That you set him up." I looked at her finally and said, "I didn't set him up. I protected myself. He ruined you both the moment he forged my name." The next week, subpoenas arrived. Martin called to let me know that county investigators had traced multiple fraudulent deeds linked to my son-in-law's company. My property was just one of several. The others belonged to retirees, widows, and small business owners, people who'd trusted their relatives to manage the paperwork. That's when it clicked. I wasn't the only one he'd targeted. My daughter wasn't his first accomplice. She was just his latest shield. When the case went public, local news stations ran a small segment about mismanaged family estates. They used my street's name but blurred details. I didn't give interviews, but I did send a statement through Martin. Documentation protects those who are too kind to imagine betrayal. It made the evening broadcast. My daughter saw it. She called again, crying this time. "They're saying I'm part of it, Dad. I didn't know." I believed her, but belief doesn't erase signatures. "Then cooperate," I said. "Tell them everything. Every email, every call, every lie. It's the only way you walk out clean." She hesitated, then said, "If I do, he'll lose everything." I sighed. So did I, so did you. Maybe that's the only way this ends right. By August, the investigation widened. My son-in-law's company folded. His partners sued him for misrepresentation. The feds opened a parallel inquiry into wire fraud. And then one morning, a county officer arrived at my lake house with a request for testimony. I didn't flinch. I spent hours in that courtroom weeks later, answering every question precisely, referring to emails, dates, notarizations. The judge looked over the documents and asked, "Mr. Weller, you caught this before it escalated. How?" I told him the truth. I read the fine print. The gallery chuckled softly, but I wasn't joking. That day, the court formally ruled that the deed I'd signed was invalidated by misrepresentation and coercion, reaffirming my ownership retroactively. But the ruling also cited my daughter as a secondary witness, not a defendant. That clause saved her. She avoided charges because she turned over correspondence voluntarily. He didn't. He was indicted in late September on 4 counts of fraud and 1 of forgery. He didn't show up to court that day. He fled. They found him 2 weeks later in Nevada, trying to liquidate crypto through an alias. It didn't matter anymore. His accounts were empty. Everything he'd stolen had been reclaimed or frozen. I remember sitting in my kitchen the night the news broke. The crickets outside, the lake still, and thinking, this could have ended quietly, if not for greed. My daughter sent me another letter, this time handwritten in long, trembling lines. "I wish I'd listened when Mom said never mix love and paperwork," she wrote. "I lost everything trying to build a life on his promises. I'm sorry, I kept that one. Not out of forgiveness, but as a reminder. Love makes you sign things without reading them, and trust makes you believe what's not written." In October, I took the last box of documents from the bank, sealed them, and stored them in a safe deposit vault under my new company. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I bought a plane ticket. Same destination they'd planned months before, Orlando. This time I actually boarded. I wanted to close the circle, to stand where I'd once been left behind and realize that every loss had returned as freedom. As the plane lifted, I looked out over the clouds and thought, they left me at the airport after they got my property. But what they really left behind was their character. And what I signed that day wasn't a surrender, it was insurance. Now, As for the rest, the calls, the settlements, the aftermath, that came later, and it turned out the deed wasn't the only paper that carried my signature. There was one more they never knew about, and it would change everything once more. That document had sat in my safe for months before any of this began. It wasn't a deed or a will or a trust, it was an agreement I'd written myself years earlier, after my wife passed. She'd insisted we set up what she called a protection clause. I didn't take it seriously back then. She'd been the cautious one. But grief makes you sentimental, and sentiment sometimes saves you. The paper was simple, a handwritten addendum filed with my attorney, stating that any transfer of property or business assets from the Weller estate must require the written approval of the primary beneficiary, my daughter, and the secondary executor, me. At the time, I added it to make her feel involved. What I didn't realize then was that I'd built a lock only I could open. When Martin found that document, he smiled in a way only lawyers do when they smell inevitability. They can't touch any residual income, pensions, or sale proceeds, he said. The clause supersedes all subsequent filings. It's ironclad. The irony? My son-in-law had already filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy using my old properties as leverage. Every fraudulent loan he'd taken was now a liability tied back to him alone. Because I had legally separated my estate before the trust revisions, none of it touched me. He'd built a pyramid on my name, and when it collapsed, he was buried under it. Meanwhile, my daughter tried to rebuild. She took a part-time job at a clinic, rented a small apartment, and started paying off debts in her name, debts he'd left behind. I didn't interfere. I sent her a check once unsigned with a note. You don't owe me, but you owe yourself a new start. She cashed it months later. Quietly. Then, around winter, something unexpected happened. The district attorney's office reached out. They'd uncovered that one of the fraudulent transactions had included forged insurance claims from my late wife's annuity. My son-in-law had used her policy as collateral years after she died, declaring himself family executor. That line alone, 2 forged signatures, turned a civil case into a criminal one. They needed me as a primary witness again. I didn't hesitate. I knew every date, every figure, and when the trial began, I sat there watching him in a cheap gray suit, thinner, his eyes darting across the courtroom like a trapped animal. He didn't look at me once. The prosecutor asked how long I'd known him. 8 years, I said. Long enough to mistake confidence for character. The courtroom was silent. They showed the documents on a projector, the deed, the forged trust transfer, and finally the annuity form. My signature had been traced digitally, pixel by pixel. The handwriting expert explained how it was copied from a scanned image of a check I'd signed in 2017. That single piece of evidence sealed it. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, he barely moved. My daughter cried in the back row. I didn't. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal custody with restitution orders to every victim. I didn't want a cent. I asked the court to direct my share toward a local housing relief fund. It felt right. No money could buy back what was lost: time, trust, family. But maybe it could protect someone else's. After the sentencing, my daughter approached me outside the courthouse. It was snowing lightly. She looked different, older, humbled, human again. He said you'd ruin him, she whispered. I nodded. He ruined himself. Then she asked, do you hate me? I took a long breath before answering. No. I hate that you didn't believe I'd have protected you if you'd just told me the truth. She nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. I know. I know now. That was the first honest thing she'd said in years. I drove home that night through the snow, the highway quiet, the headlights carving pale tunnels through the dark. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anger or vindication, just clarity. Betrayal is loud when it happens, but peace arrives quietly like snowfall. I parked in front of my lake house, walked inside, and sat by the fireplace, the deed resting on the table beside me. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Paper doesn't protect you. Foresight does. A few months later, I received an envelope from the Federal Restitution Board. Inside was a check, his first payment from prison labor income, a few dollars at most. I laughed quietly and sent it back with a note. Keep it. Consider it your lesson fee. Now it's spring again. The lake's thawed, the birds have returned, and I've started a small side business helping retirees audit their estate documents. I never charge. I tell them my story, not the pain but the process. The clause, the second opinion, the habit of reading every line. Some call it paranoia. I call it survival. Because once upon a time, my own daughter and her husband left me stranded at an airport thinking they'd won. But the truth is that day wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of me reclaiming everything that mattered. And as I sit here watching the sun drop behind the water, I realize something that took a lifetime to learn. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just signs quietly in black ink and waits for justice to arrive in the mail. By early summer, the story had become something of a quiet legend in our county. Contractors whispered about it at supply shops. Realtors used it as a cautionary tale in seminars. Always read every clause, even from family. Some thought I'd masterminded the whole thing, that I'd baited my son-in-law into a trap. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The truth was simpler and sadder. I just learned too late how expensive trust can be. One afternoon in July, a letter arrived from a lawyer in another state, Arizona. Inside was a short formal statement. Mr. Weller, we represent several elderly clients affected by the same fraudulent transactions. Your documentation was instrumental in uncovering the scheme. We'd like to thank you for your cooperation. Attached was a check for $48,000, part of a recovered restitution pool awarded to cooperating witnesses. I stared at that number for a while. Not because of what it could buy, but because it was almost the exact amount I'd spent paying off my son-in-law's investment debts years ago. I endorsed it and sent half to my daughter anonymously. The rest I donated to the same veteran housing project, but even peace has echoes. A few months later, I received an unexpected visitor. My grandson, 13 now, standing on my porch with a backpack and a folded letter from his mother. She said you might not want to see her, he said, but maybe you'd still want to see me. I did. I let him in. We spent the evening fishing by the lake, not talking about lawyers or deeds, just about life. School, baseball, the stars. When he fell asleep on the couch that night, I found the letter tucked in his bag. My daughter had written, "He deserves to know you," not the version his father told him about. I left the letter unopened for 3 days before finally reading it. It wasn't a plea. It was a confession. She wrote that she'd testified fully, paid every fine, and filed for divorce. He said I was nothing without him, she wrote. But I realized I'm still my father's daughter, the one who used to sit beside him at the kitchen table while he read contracts out loud. That line broke something inside me. Or maybe it mended it. Over the next few months, my grandson began spending weekends at the lake. I showed him how to split wood, how to read a map, how to tell when someone's offering a handshake or a deal. He was a smart kid, too smart to be raised on someone else's lies. We never talked about the court case, but one day he asked, "Grandpa, what did you mean when you said paper can lie?" I smiled a little and answered, "Because ink never feels guilty." He nodded, not fully understanding, but someday he will. By autumn, I'd rebuilt something I hadn't expected. Not wealth, not reputation, but family. The kind that's quiet, cautious, earned. My daughter started visiting again. Slow steps at first, helping around the house, cooking dinner on weekends. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. Every gesture was an apology neither of us had the courage to voice. Then one day, while sorting old files, I came across the original deed, the one they'd tried to steal. I stared at my handwriting, the ink slightly faded, the notary seal embossed deep into the paper. I realized it wasn't just a legal record. It was a story of loyalty misplaced, foresight rewarded, and bloodlines tested. I placed it back in the safe, this time under a single note that read, "Trust once lost returns as vigilance." Now I live differently. No grand gestures, no expectations. I mow my own lawn, fix my own gutters, and spend evenings watching the water turn gold. Sometimes I get letters from strangers, people who saw my name in those court documents thanking me for exposing the fraud that might have taken their homes too. I always write back, "Protect what you've earned, but never let protection turn into bitterness." Because in the end, revenge wasn't the point. The real victory was calm, knowing that every choice I made, every clause I added, every silence I held, was mine alone. And every time I drive past the airport now, I glance at the departure lanes and think about that morning. The empty curb, The black suitcase, the car that never came back. I don't feel anger anymore. Just a small, steady peace. They left me there after they thought they'd got my property. But I was never stranded. I was simply waiting for them to reveal who they really were. And once they did, all I had to do was sign my name one last time. By the time the first frost came that year, I'd stopped checking the mail for anything that wasn't necessary. Bills, statements, tax forms, those I handled promptly. But anything with handwriting, stamps, or emotions went straight to a drawer. The storm had passed, yet every gust of memory still rattled the old frame of who I'd been. A man who built a life for others, only to have them try to sell it back to him. You learn to measure love differently after that, not in words but in follow-through. And the truth was, my daughter had begun to show hers quietly. Weekend visits, holiday dinners, handwritten notes in my kitchen. She'd lost everything but earned something more valuable: accountability. In late November, she asked if I'd attend a charity dinner her clinic was hosting. "They're honoring donors who helped the fraud victims," she said. "They might call your name." I hesitated. I wasn't interested in applause, but I went anyway for her. The room was full of people in modest suits and kind eyes, widows, veterans, retirees, all of them survivors of someone else's greed. The host mentioned a phrase that stuck with me. Restitution is just money. Restoration is what we owe each other. When my name was read, the applause wasn't loud, just steady. I stood, nodded once, and sat back down. My daughter smiled through tears. That was enough. After the event, a younger man approached me, maybe in his 30s, sharp tie, nervous energy. "Mr. Weller, I work in estate law," he said. "Your case changed how we draft family agreements now. We include a verification clause called the Weller Amendment." I almost laughed. "That's unnecessary," I said. "No, sir," he replied. "It's protection. You saved people you'll never meet." That hit harder than I expected. You spend decades building things, houses, companies, savings, and think those are your legacy. But sometimes it's a single paragraph buried in a contract that outlives you. That winter, I kept the lake house warm with wood from the old property I'd reclaimed years ago. My grandson helped chop and stack it, his breath puffing white in the air. He'd grown taller, steadier, asking more questions about right and wrong, about forgiveness. One night by the fire, he asked, "Do you miss him? Mom's old husband?" I stirred the embers before answering. "I don't miss who he was. I miss who we thought he was." He nodded slowly. "Mom said you forgave her." I looked at him. "Forgiveness isn't a gift," I said. "It's maintenance. Like oiling a lock, keeps the past from rusting shut." He smiled faintly and went back to poking the fire. Kids understand more than we think. In January, I received a certified letter from the Bureau of Prisons. Inside was a formal apology, typed impersonal, notifying me that my son-in-law had applied for early release based on rehabilitation efforts. Attached was his own handwritten note, surprisingly short. "You were right about everything. I never built anything, only borrowed it. Tell her I'm sorry." I didn't respond, but I placed the letter in a box labeled closure, alongside the deed, the court order, and my wife's old photo. Not as a keepsake, but as documentation. Proof that every wrong eventually writes itself out if you give it enough ink and time. By spring, my daughter and grandson had moved closer, renting a small cottage on the far side of the lake. I helped them paint, fix the gutters, plant a small garden. We spoke about normal things now. Groceries, weather, the dog. The silence between us had changed texture. It was no longer avoidance but peace. One evening she handed me a folder. "It's something new," she said. Inside were documents for her own clinic, a non-profit offering free legal and financial workshops for seniors. "We named it after Mom," she whispered. "She always said you can't lose what you understand." I looked at the logo, a small blue heron above the words, "The Clara Foundation." For the first time in years, I felt pride without pain. As months passed, the town began to feel smaller, like a story reaching its final page. I spent mornings at the cafe, reading the paper, answering calls from people seeking advice about property disputes. Some offered to pay. I always declined. Once, an old farmer told me, "You're the reason they stopped preying on folks like me." I told him it wasn't me. It was documentation, diligence, and a little bit of luck. But he shook his head. "No, it's because you didn't stay quiet." And maybe that's the lesson no lawyer can draft into a clause. Silence protects the wrong people. I'd spent too long keeping peace by saying nothing, believing family meant safety. But safety isn't guaranteed by blood. It's earned by behavior. Now, when I look at my reflection in the lake, I see the man I should have been all along. Cautious but kind, firm without anger. My story stopped being about revenge a long time ago. It became about reclamation, of dignity, of legacy, of self. Sometimes at night, when the wind shifts and the train whistles miles away, I remember that airport morning. The hum of engines, the rolling suitcase, the feeling of abandonment disguised as farewell. But the bitterness is gone. What remains is understanding. They didn't leave me behind. They revealed what leaving looks like. And in that clarity, I finally rest easy. Because the deed I signed wasn't a surrender. It was the beginning of a boundary. And in this quiet house by the lake, surrounded by the echoes of lessons learned in hard ink, I know this much too. Be true. You don't measure a man by what he loses, but by what he refuses to sign away. By midsummer, the lake shimmered like glass and the days ran slow. Coffee, repair work, phone calls from people I barely knew asking if I could look over a contract or help them track a missing payment. I never said no. It became a kind of mission. Every stranger's panic reminded me of that morning at the airport, and I couldn't stand the idea of anyone else sitting on a cold bench, realizing too late what they'd signed. Word got around, and soon the post office box I'd rented under the name CW Associates started filling up with thick envelopes, copies of wills, handwritten letters, sometimes cash folded inside with notes that said, "Thank you." I mailed the money back, always with the same message: read first, sign later. One morning I found a new envelope. No return address, only a correctional facility seal. The handwriting was familiar. My son-in-law. I almost tossed it in the fire, but curiosity won. He wrote about prison programs, teaching accounting, to inmates, and the first time he understood what numbers really meant when they were connected to people instead of profit. At the end, one line caught me. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I finally understand why you smiled that day in court. You'd already moved on." I folded the letter and put it with the others. Maybe one day my grandson will read it and understand what consequences look like in ink and steel. That fall, my daughter's foundation grew fast. Local banks partnered with her to host financial truth nights, teaching seniors to spot fraud and family manipulation. I spoke at one in October, standing in front of a crowd of 80 people, none of whom knew my story firsthand. I told them about page 11, about the way love can blind you to fine print, about the importance of naming a secondary executor. When it ended, an older woman came up to me and said, "You sound like a man who lost everything." I smiled. "No, ma'am," I said. "I sound like a man who learned what to keep." Around the same time, my grandson turned 15. He asked to learn to drive, and I let him take the old pickup around the property. He was careful, deliberate, eyes steady on the road. Watching him, I realized that the best legacy isn't land or money, it's composure. When he parked, he said, "Mom told me you still have the old deed framed." I nodded. "She said it reminds you not to trust anyone?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "It reminds me not to sign in a hurry." He laughed, and for the first time I heard the sound of my family healing. Quiet, genuine, unscripted. That winter, I received one last official letter from the state. The restitution program had closed, the accounts were reconciled, and the last remaining lien against my name was cleared. The past was now only paper, archived and sealed. I walked down to the frozen lake that evening, the air sharp, the ice creaking under my boots. I thought of my wife, of every promise I'd made and broken, of every signature that bound or freed me. There was no anger left, only gratitude that the ink had dried. The world moved on, as it always does. My daughter remarried quietly, to a teacher this time, a man with rough hands and patient eyes. My grandson left for college studying finance, though he says he'll never work for a bank. "I just want to understand the system before it understands me," he told me. Smart kid. Sometimes reporters still reach out wanting to revisit the airport case, as they call it now. They want to film me by the water, holding the deed like some kind of trophy. I always decline. Because the truth doesn't need retelling, it just needs remembering. So I stay here, in this house built on reclaimed ground, every board nailed with intent. I tend the garden, patch the roof, and write letters to strangers who think they're alone in the wreckage of betrayal. My hands ache when the rain comes, but that's age, not regret. And when the storm passes, I step out onto the porch and look across the lake, where lights from my daughter's home shimmer faintly through the mist. We wave sometimes. No words, just recognition. Two people who learned the same lesson in different decades. Because in the end, revenge wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. That boundaries aren't walls. They're maps back to yourself. And as I sit here, tonight the deed tucked away, the pen on my desk, I know exactly where every line leads. They left me at the airport after they thought they'd got my property. But all I ever lost was my silence. And that, I'll never sign away again. When spring returned the following year, I noticed how the lake thawed in slow ripples. The ice dissolving exactly the way resentment does, quietly, one layer at a time. I'd started keeping a journal again, not because I wanted to document revenge, but because I wanted to remember peace. The pages were filled with things my younger self never valued. The way morning light hit the cedar planks, the sound of my daughter's laughter through the phone, the smell of wood smoke after rain. It's strange how you start noticing life again once you've stopped fighting to keep it under control. But peace is maintenance. Like a house, it creaks if you stop tending to it. One morning I got a call from Martin, my attorney, the same man who'd been there through every step of that disaster. "You ever think about writing this down?" he asked. I laughed. "That's what you're for." He chuckled. "No, I mean really write it. People could learn from it. Call it the clause." I didn't answer right away. A book about betrayal didn't appeal to me. The world already had too many of those. But later that night, when I found my grandson's old notebook in the living room, the one he'd used to practice his signature, I realized maybe the story wasn't about betrayal. It was about awareness. So I began writing. The first sentence came easy. They thought they'd won, but they never understood what they'd signed. From there, the rest unfolded like memory. Courtroom scenes, airport silence, the phone calls, the paperwork that saved me. I wrote for weeks, slow and deliberate, each paragraph a reckoning. When I was done, it wasn't a story of vengeance. It was a ledger of lessons. I called it page 11. My daughter read the draft first. She cried not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. "You wrote us down without anger," she said. "That's harder than forgiveness." A small local publisher printed a limited run, just a few hundred copies. I never promoted it. But something strange happened. People began passing it around. Churches, libraries, senior centers. Letters started arriving again, this time not asking for help, but offering thanks. "You saved my mother's house," one said. "You helped me walk away from my brother's scam," said another. Each note reminded me that even quiet stories ripple wider than we expect. By midsummer, page 11 had somehow made its way into legal workshops and university courses. One professor wrote that it was a masterclass in emotional restraint and procedural clarity. I didn't know what that meant, but I liked the sound of it. Still, I stayed away from the spotlight. When local news tried to interview me, I told them, "If you want the story, read the book. If you want the lesson, check your own contracts." Meanwhile, life went on. My grandson came home from college one weekend with a proposal. "Grandpa, what if we start a mentorship program, teaching teenagers about money before they make mistakes?" I smiled. "You mean before they trust the wrong people?" He grinned. "Exactly." So we did. Once a month, the community center opened its doors, and I stood in front of 20 curious faces with notebooks and restless energy. I told them about my mistakes, not my victories. "You want to know the fastest way to lose everything?" I'd ask. "Let someone else convince you it's safe." They'd laugh, thinking it was a joke, but by the end, they always asked for copies of page 11. My daughter handled the logistics. The foundation provided funding, and slowly it became something real, a movement almost. Families began rewriting their estate documents, adding protection clauses, demanding transparency. The county even passed an ordinance requiring legal disclosures for family property transfers. It didn't bear my name, but I knew where it started. Sometimes, though, even peace leaves you restless. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, I took the old suitcase, the same one from the airport, out of the closet. It was still half empty. I packed only what mattered. The first, copy of page 11, a photo of my wife by the lake, and a clean notepad. I didn't plan on leaving. I just needed to remind myself how far I'd come since the day that suitcase symbolized loss. Now it meant readiness for anything. Later that night, I walked the shoreline, moonlight cutting silver paths across the water. I thought about how every story, no matter how painful, eventually becomes someone else's survival guide. Mine just happened to begin where most end, at betrayal. The trick, I realized, isn't avoiding betrayal. It's refusing to let it rewrite who you are. The next morning, my daughter stopped by with coffee. She stood by the porch railing, watching the light move across the water, and said, "You know, the night you signed that deed, I thought you were giving up. I didn't realize you were documenting the lesson that would save us both." I didn't answer. Sometimes silence says it better. It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. Early autumn. The kind of morning where mist still hangs low over the lake, soft enough that the world feels half asleep. My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter, an unfamiliar number from out of state. I let it ring twice before picking up. A man's voice, calm, measured, official. "Mr. Weller, this is Agent Donovan with the Department of Financial Crimes. I believe you're familiar with a Mr. Ethan Miles?" The name hit me like a dropped glass. My son-in-law. I hadn't heard it spoken aloud in nearly 4 years. "He's been released under supervision," the agent continued, "and there's been an issue involving restitution records. We'd like to confirm some signatures." I agreed to meet the next day at the local field office. I told no one. Not my daughter, not Martin, not even my grandson. Some ghosts are better handled alone. When I arrived, the agent greeted me politely and laid out a folder. Inside were scanned documents, checks, wire authorizations, letters, all signed recently with my name. My real name. I stared at the handwriting. It was good. Too good. "He's using me again," I said quietly. Donovan nodded. "We traced them to an LLC registered under his halfway house roommate. He's trying to start a consultancy business. You were listed as guarantor." I almost laughed. The man learned nothing. They asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes, but not out of anger. Out of principle. "People like him count on fatigue," I told them. "They think the victims stop watching once they get justice. But the only real closure is vigilance." Donovan nodded slowly. "You'd be surprised how few people stay alert after the verdict." "I'm not," I said. "That's why he keeps trying." When I drove home that evening, the lake was mirror still, reflecting the sky in such perfect detail it almost looked solid. That's when it hit me. I wasn't angry at him anymore. I was angry at how many versions of him the world still produced. Charming, confident, careless with other people's lives. So I decided to do something about it. Over the next few months, I turned the mentorship program my grandson and I had built into something larger, the Page 11 Initiative. It became a nonprofit dedicated to teaching financial literacy, estate safety, and fraud prevention nationwide. We built an online course, filmed videos, partnered with legal clinics. My daughter managed operations. My grandson handled the technology, and I became the reluctant spokesman. I didn't like cameras, but I liked the cause. Within a year, we were speaking at conferences, training bank officers, consulting on new state laws protecting elderly homeowners. I never once mentioned Ethan by name. He didn't deserve that kind of immortality. But life has a way of circling back. One afternoon after a seminar in Chicago, I was approached by a woman maybe in her 30s. "Mr. Weller," she said softly. "I knew Ethan. He was different inside." I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "He talked about you a lot. Said you were the only man who ever forced him to look in a mirror." She hesitated. "He died 2 months ago. Heart failure. He'd been working construction, trying to pay restitution. For a long moment I couldn't speak, not because I mourned him, but because the final line of his story had been written without my input. All the paperwork, all the clauses, all the signatures, and still, time had the last word. That night in my hotel room, I opened my journal and wrote a single line. Justice can close the case, but it can't stop the clock. I didn't feel triumph or guilt, just inevitability. I thought about calling my daughter, but decided against it. Some news carries its own silence. When I returned home, the air smelled of pine and rain. My daughter was waiting on the porch holding a cup of coffee. "You heard?" she said. I nodded. "It's over," she whispered. "No," I said quietly. "It ended." "That's different." We sat there for a while, not talking. The wind off the lake moved through the trees. And for the first time since all of it began, I realized the story wasn't about retribution, it was about release. Weeks later, my grandson printed the first annual report for the Page 11 initiative. On the last page in small type, he'd added a quote I didn't recognize. "Integrity is the only deed that needs no witness." "Yours?" I asked. He smiled. "No, yours. You said it once when I was 12. I didn't remember, but it sounded like something I would have said in those days when my words were still armor." The organization kept growing. Letters came from people across the country, some who'd recovered stolen property, others who'd prevented scams before they began. One letter stood out. "My son tried to take my farm after I got sick. I read your book and realized what he was doing. I kept my land. I read it 3 times, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my wife's photo. That's when I finally understood what all of this had been for. It wasn't about the house or the land or the bank accounts. It was about continuity, the quiet handoff of wisdom between those who've been broken and those still untested. The deed was just paper. The legacy was what we wrote afterward. That night I stood by the lake again, moonlight stretching across the surface like a thin path home. I thought about every signature I'd ever made, every mistake, every clause that saved me. Life, I realized, is one long contract between who you were and who you promised to become. Some of us just learned to read the fine print sooner. And yet, even with all the calm I'd built, something in me knew there was one final thing left unfinished. One last document that hadn't been signed, but needed to be. I didn't know it then, but the next chapter would bring that realization straight to my door. It arrived on a gray morning, the kind that makes even the birds sound tired. The envelope was thick, official, sealed with the blue crest of the county probate court. For a second, I thought it was another clerical notice from the Page 11 initiative, but when I opened it, I froze. Inside was a single-page summons bearing my daughter's name, not as a plaintiff or defendant, but as an executor. And under it, my own. The court was notifying us that a final estate review was due for my late wife's residual holdings. The ones we'd forgotten about. The ones never updated after her passing. A sliver of unfinished business, waiting all these years like a seed under frost. I sat down at the kitchen table and unfolded the old copy of her will from my files. My wife's handwriting still curled neatly across the margins. Gentle but firm. All residual accounts to be divided equally between my husband and our daughter, with oversight shared. She had always believed in shared oversight. Maybe she knew that one day we'd need something to hold us together again. That afternoon, I called my daughter and told her to meet me at the courthouse. She hesitated but agreed. The next morning, we stood side by side before the clerk signing new certification forms. The clerk, a woman in her 40s with a patient smile, said, "This will finalize your wife's estate and no disputes, no liens, no pending claims. You'll both co-own whatever remains." My daughter looked at me and asked quietly, "Are you sure you want that?" I nodded. "Your mother wrote it that way for a reason." And so, we signed. Together. Afterward, we went for coffee. The air was cool, the kind of stillness that comes after long storms. My daughter stirred her cup absent-mindedly. "It feels strange," she said, "to be signing something with you again." I smiled faintly. "Feels right to me." Then she said something that caught me off guard. "When he took everything from you, I thought he was proving he was smarter. But you didn't fight him with anger. You fought him with patience. That's what I didn't understand until now." I didn't reply. There are lessons only time can translate. We finished our coffee, and as she walked me to my car, she slipped her hand through my arm. It was a small gesture, but it bridged years. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "Not just for what I did and for what I didn't see." I looked at her and said, "Then let's both stop looking back." She nodded, eyes glistening. Weeks passed. The estate funds arrived, modest but clean. We decided to donate most of it to the Clara Foundation in my wife's name, the final loop in a story that had begun with deceit and ended with legacy. One evening, as I watched my daughter and grandson plant a small tree by the water, it struck me. This was the real inheritance. Not land, not money, continuity. Roots re-established in good soil. That night, I took out my journal for the last time. I wrote down everything I'd learned, not for publication, not for law, but for understanding. The last page read, "Revenge ends when peace no longer needs an audience. Documentation saves money. Forgiveness saves time. Both are currency and spend them carefully." Then I walked outside, sat on the porch, and let the quiet settle around me. The air was cool, the sky heavy with stars. The lake reflected them like scattered signatures across black glass. I thought about every version of myself, the betrayed man at the airport, the tired one at the motel, the resolute one in the courtroom, the teacher in the community hall. Each one had been necessary to write this ending. Somewhere across the lake, I saw my daughter's house lights flicker off one by one. For the first time in decades, I realized the story was complete, not because justice had been done, but because understanding had taken its place. The deed was settled, the past recorded, the future notarized in peace. Now the house is quiet. I'm old, slower, deliberate. I keep the first signed deed in a frame, not as a warning, but as a reminder. The paper never betrayed me. People did. And people can change. Maybe that's enough. So if you've listened this far, let me ask you something. What would you have done? Would you have fought back the same way, through silence and precision, or walked away and started over? Tell me, when everything you built is taken by the people you love, do you fight to reclaim it, or do you let the paper speak for you?